In the autumn of 476 AD, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus was deposed as emperor of the Western Roman Empire by a Germanic commander named Odoacer. Romulus was not killed. He was sent to live in a comfortable villa on the Bay of Naples, a small pension, a pleasant view, and no further obligations to the state he had nominally led. Odoacer did not declare himself emperor of Rome. He did not torch the city or auction off the provinces. He simply sent a letter to Constantinople, to the Eastern Emperor Zeno, with the imperial regalia enclosed, and explained that a single emperor was sufficient for the whole Roman world. That was it. The Western Roman Empire, the state that had ruled most of the known Western world for 5 centuries, ended in a letter and a pension. This makes it difficult to explain as a catastrophe. There was no last stand, no burning of the capital, no dramatic battle between civilization and its enemies. And yet the world after 476 AD was unmistakably different from the world before it. The roads were still there, but fewer were maintained. The cities were still occupied, but many had shrunk. The Latin language persisted, but the administrative structures that had used it were gone. The legal traditions continued, but the army that had enforced them was no longer Roman in any meaningful sense. Something genuinely large had ended. The question is why? The honest answer is that it took a century to end, that no single cause is sufficient, and that historians have been arguing about the causes ever since. The people who lived through it often did not know what they were experiencing. They called themselves Romans. They called their kings and generals by Roman titles. They participated in Roman legal traditions and built churches in Roman architectural forms. The collapse was visible in retrospect, in ways it was not visible at the time. That makes it both harder to explain and more important to explain carefully. This is the story of how the most powerful political organization in the Western world became a collection of Germanic kingdoms, and why the process was slower, more complicated, and more strange than the phrase, "the fall of Rome," suggests. The empire Theodosius I handed to his sons in 395 AD was enormous. It stretched from Britain to Egypt, from the Atlantic coast of Iberia to the upper reaches of the Euphrates. It contained dozens of languages, dozens of climates, dozens of economies. The Rhine and Danube frontiers formed a line nearly 3,000 kilometers long. The Mediterranean was an interior sea, Roman on every coast. The empire had administered this territory through a combination of legions, roads, provincial governors, tax collectors, and a legal system that reached into everyday life in cities far from Rome itself. The administrative achievement was staggering. A letter could travel from Constantinople to the Rhine using the imperial postal system, changing horses at relay stations. A dispute in Carthage could be appealed to Roman law. A soldier recruited in Britain might serve his career in Syria. The empire was not a loose collection of allied cities. It was a functioning bureaucratic and military state that extracted resources, deployed force, administered justice, and maintained legitimacy over a territory of extraordinary scale and diversity. It had also nearly collapsed once before. The crisis of the 3rd century, from about 235 to 284 AD, saw the empire fragment under the pressure of simultaneous frontier invasions, economic disruption, and an almost continuous series of military coups. More than 50 emperors or claimants ruled in that half-century. The empire broke apart into separate pieces: the Gallic Empire in the northwest, the Pomeranian Empire in the east, and then was reunified by a series of strong military emperors. Diocletian and then Constantine stabilized the state through deep administrative reform, a new doubled administration that divided the empire into eastern and western halves under co-emperors, and eventually the adoption of Christianity as a unifying ideological framework. The reforms worked. The empire came back, but they also changed the structure in ways that would matter later. Diocletian's reforms multiplied the number of provinces, increased the bureaucracy, separated civilian and military command, and tied the tax system more tightly to military supply. He also divided the empire administratively into a tetrarchy, 4 rulers governing 4 geographic zones, which had the practical effect of creating parallel imperial courts with separate armies, separate loyalties, and separate political cultures. The tetrarchy itself did not survive Diocletian's retirement, but the principle of divided administration became permanent. Constantine moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople in 330 AD, a decision that over the following century placed the wealthiest and most strategic part of the empire firmly in the east. The weight of the empire shifted. The west was still Roman, but it was no longer the center. Constantine's other great change was the church. He did not simply tolerate Christianity. He made it an increasingly central institution of imperial governance. Bishops received legal authority to arbitrate disputes. Church councils became occasions for defining the ideological unity of the state. The church's administrative hierarchy, which mirrored the Roman provincial system, became a parallel structure of authority that could function even when the imperial state could not. This would matter enormously after 476 AD. The 4th century was not a century of obvious decline. Theodosius, and his predecessors still commanded enormous armies. The empire still collected taxes across an enormous territory. Julian could campaign in Persia. Valentinian could repair the Rhine frontier. The period looks from inside like a functioning if strained great power. The stresses were real, military expenses were chronically high, frontier pressure was never absent, and succession remained a political vulnerability, but none of them pointed inevitably toward the 5th century fragmentation. Something had to change the trajectory, and the change came from outside the imperial frontier. The Huns changed the calculation in ways the Romans could not have anticipated. The Hunnic peoples, nomadic and mounted, appeared at the eastern edge of the Gothic world in the early 370s AD and began moving westward at speed. Who they were, exactly where they came from, and what drove the expansion of their power are questions historians still debate. What is clear is the effect. The peoples east of the Roman frontier were displaced. Gothic federations that had coexisted with Rome for generations found themselves under pressure from a cavalry force they could not easily resist. Rather than fight or flee into the steppe, many of them turned toward the Roman frontier. In 376 AD, a large group of Gothic peoples, the group historians call the Visigoths, approached the Danube and asked to cross into Roman territory. The Eastern Emperor Valens agreed. This decision was not obviously reckless at the time. Rome had long absorbed peoples from across the frontier, and the Goths were not strangers. Many had served in Roman military units for decades. Gothic soldiers had fought in Roman armies as far back as the 3rd century. Gothic merchants traded across the Danube. There was a Gothic Christian community whose bishop, Ulfilas, had translated the Bible into Gothic using an alphabet he had invented for the purpose. These were not unknown peoples arriving from nowhere. The plan was to settle them in Roman territory as military settlers, Foederati who would provide troops in exchange for land and protection. It was a familiar arrangement, scaled up. The arrangement immediately fell apart. The Roman officials responsible for feeding and supplying the crossing Goths exploited and cheated them. Food that should have been distributed was sold back to the migrants at extortionate prices. Men sold themselves or their children into slavery to eat. When the Goths protested and then rose in revolt, the Roman response was punitive. But the army sent to suppress them was not prepared for Gothic cavalry. Skirmishes escalated into a major engagement. In August 378 AD, at the Battle of Adrianople in what is now Bulgaria, a Roman field army met a Gothic force near the city. The Roman infantry formed their battle line while waiting for Gothic cavalry to return to the field. The cavalry returned before the Romans expected it. The legions, caught while deploying, were encircled. Emperor Valens was killed. Some sources say in the battle. Some say trying to escape. None agree on the exact circumstances. Approximately 2/3 of the Eastern Field Army was destroyed. Adrianople was not the end of Rome. The empire absorbed the blow, and within 4 years Theodosius had negotiated a new settlement. The Visigoths were allowed to remain in Roman territory as autonomous Foederati. not as individual Roman citizens who paid taxes and served in regular legions, but as a distinct group under their own leaders, obligated to provide military units when Rome needed them. It was a workable arrangement in the short term. In the longer term, it created a precedent that would be used again and again. A large, organized, armed people living inside Roman territory with their own leaders and their own interests. The word Foederati carried the implication of a contract, but contracts require enforcement mechanisms. A federated people that Rome could not expel, could not fully tax, and whose internal loyalty ran to their own leaders rather than to the imperial state, was not simply a provincial population. It was a separate power that happened to occupy Roman land. As the 5th century progressed and Rome's ability to enforce contracts declined, the distinction between federated allies and successor rulers would become increasingly difficult to maintain. The Foederati arrangement also changed the Roman army in ways that were structural and cumulative. The traditional Roman legion, a unit of Roman citizens, organized into cohorts, drilled to fight in coordinated formation, legally bound to the state by oath and pension, was still the ideal. But the late 4th and 5th century Roman army increasingly relied on units that fought in their own traditional ways, under their own officers, for their own reasons. Some of these units were highly effective. They won battles. They were capable soldiers. But their loyalty was to their commanders, their communities, and their contracts, not to the abstract idea of the Roman state. An army of people fighting for Rome because they are Roman citizens with Roman land and Roman futures is different from an army of people fighting for Rome because they have been paid in gold and promised territory. The first kind stays when the money runs out. The second kind negotiates. Theodosius died in 395 AD. He was the last emperor to rule both halves of the Roman world from a single throne. His 2 sons divided the empire. Arcadius was 18 years old and took the east from Constantinople. Honorius was 10 years old and took the west with the administrative capital moved to Milan and later Ravenna. Neither son was a military or political leader of significant capability. Both were managed by court factions and powerful generals. The structural question of who actually ran the empire, the emperor or the powerful men around him, became acute in both halves, but especially the West. In the West, the most powerful figure for the next 13 years was not an emperor. It was Stilicho, a general of Vandal descent who had married the niece of Theodosius I and commanded the Western armies. Stilicho was one of the most capable military commanders of his age. He understood the Gothic leaders personally. He had negotiated with Alaric, the Visigoth chieftain, multiple times and had found ways to limit Gothic operations even when he could not defeat them outright. He held the Alpine passes against invasion. He organized effective resistance to threats on multiple fronts. He was, in practice, the man who held the West together. He was also a man of mixed ancestry, commanding an increasingly Germanic army in service of an emperor too young and too disinterested to govern. This made him vulnerable. In 408 AD, court rivals, suspicious of his dealings with Alaric, alarmed by his power, and playing on ethnic anxieties about a commander of barbarian descent, persuaded Honorius to have Stilicho arrested and executed. His supporters in the army were killed. The families of Gothic troops serving in the Roman military were attacked by Roman mobs. Thousands of Germanic soldiers who had served Rome loyally promptly defected to Alaric. Alaric had been circling Rome for years. He had commanded Visigoth forces in Roman service, been denied the titles and payments he sought, invaded Italy, retreated under negotiation, invaded again. He wanted land in the Balkans for his people, an official Roman military commission for himself, and the security of a recognized position within the imperial system. He did not want to destroy Rome. He wanted a seat at the Roman table. Every time he was close to a negotiated settlement, something broke down, usually the decision-making of Honorius's court in Ravenna, safely insulated behind marshes and walls while Rome itself was blockaded. In August 410 AD, the gates of Rome were opened by slaves inside the city, according to some sources, and Alaric's Visigoths entered. They spent 3 days there. They sacked the city. They took gold, silver, bronze, grain, and hostages. They did not burn the major buildings or kill the population systematically. By the standards of ancient siege warfare, the sack was relatively restrained. But it was the first time in 800 years that a foreign force had entered and sacked Rome. The psychological impact was enormous. Jerome, writing in Bethlehem, called it the end of the world. My voice sticks in my throat, and as I dictate, sobs choke my utterance. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. Augustine of Hippo began writing The City of God partly in response to pagan claims that Rome had fallen because it had abandoned its old gods. The sack of 410 AD shook the empire's idea of itself, not because Rome was actually the seat of government anymore, but because it was still the symbol. The city that had defined what the Mediterranean world meant had been violated. Alaric died of illness in southern Italy shortly after, before he could negotiate the settlement he had sought. His successors eventually moved the Visigoths into Gaul and then Spain. Rome had not fallen, but it had been shown that it could be entered. The inviolability that had protected the psychological foundation of Roman power was gone. The decades after 410 AD were a sustained, slow deterioration in the West. The empire still existed. It still had emperors, armies, courts, laws, and tax collectors. But the territory it controlled was shrinking, the revenue it collected was falling, and the military it could put in the field was increasingly dependent on federated people whose commitment to the imperial project was instrumental rather than ideological. Gaul was the clearest example. The Rhine frontier had been crossed in force during the winter of 405–406 AD, when the frozen river allowed large groups of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi to cross into Roman territory. The Roman army on the Rhine was not capable of stopping them. Britain had already been stripped of troops for use on the continent. Local commanders in Britain, isolated and unsupported, had proclaimed their own emperors in the chaotic tradition of the 3rd century. The Western court in Ravenna could not respond to every emergency at once. By the time Honorius famously wrote to the British cities to defend themselves with their own forces, in a letter probably dated around 410 AD, Roman administration in Britain was effectively over. Iberia became increasingly a landscape of competing federated groups, Visigoths, Vandals, Suebi operating under nominal Roman suzerainty, but in practice managing their own territories. The Gallic aristocracy made its accommodations. The church continued to function. The legal traditions continued in modified forms. But the machinery of the Roman state, the legions, the tax system, the provincial governors reporting to the imperial center, was withdrawing from the periphery, concentrating what resources remained on Italy and the core. Then came the Vandals. Under their king Gazaric, they crossed from Iberia to North Africa in 429 AD. This was the worst strategic blow the West suffered after Adrianople. North Africa, modern Tunisia, Algeria, and Libya, was the wealthiest region of the Western Empire. Its agriculture fed Rome. Its tax revenue financed the Western army. Its ports connected the Mediterranean grain trade. Without African revenue, the Western Empire could not pay for enough soldiers, could not maintain enough ships, and could not supply enough grain to keep Italy stable. Gazaric took Carthage in 439 AD, and the West never recovered it. The loss of Africa explains more about the 5th century collapse than the sack of 410 AD does. The empire that had survived Adrianople, survived the Rhine crossing, survived the sack of Rome, and survived the fragmenting of Gaul, was structurally weakened by the loss of Africa in ways that were arithmetical rather than psychological. You could not maintain the Western Empire's military commitments on the tax revenue that remained. Every subsequent attempt to reclaim Africa failed. Every subsequent emperor had to make do with less. The man who tried to hold the West together after the African loss was Aetius. Like Stilicho before him, Aetius was a general rather than an emperor, the effective ruler of the West operating in the name of the child, and then young man Emperor Valentinian Roman III. Unlike Stilicho, Aetius had spent time as a hostage among the Hunnic peoples and understood their tactics and their politics. He used Hunnic cavalry as mercenaries when he needed to suppress revolts in Gaul. He maintained a network of relationships with federated leaders that kept a rough Roman authority over territories that no longer fully obeyed Rome. His greatest test came in 451 AD, when Attila turned the Hunnic focus westward and invaded Gaul. The scale of the campaign was extraordinary. Attila crossed the Rhine with a force large enough to push deep into Gaul, sacking cities including Metz and threatening the major population centers. Aetius assembled a coalition that included Romans, Visigoths, Franks, Burgundians, and various federated peoples, former enemies now fighting together because Attila threatened all of them equally. At the Catalaunian Plains, in roughly what is now the Champagne region of northeastern France, the coalition met Attila's forces. The battle was inconclusive in the tactical sense. Both sides took heavy casualties. The Visigoth king Theodoric I was killed in the fighting. Attila retreated to his camp and prepared for a last stand. Aetius, in one of the most debated decisions in late Roman history, allowed him to withdraw rather than forcing a final engagement. The ancient sources offer various explanations. A desire to preserve the Hunnic threat as a counterweight to Visigoth power, uncertainty about whether the coalition would hold, concern about casualties. What we know is that Attila left Gaul. He returned the next year. In 452 AD, Attila invaded Italy. He sacked Aquileia, which had been one of the major cities of northeastern Italy, so completely that its ruins would become the source of legends about refugees founding Venice. He took Verona, Vicenza, Milan. Aetius had no forces capable of stopping him in the field. The only thing that stopped Attila from marching on Rome itself was a combination of factors historians still debate: disease in his army, supply difficulties, a plague, the threat of the Eastern army marching to cut off his retreat, and a famous meeting near Mantua with a delegation that included Pope Leo I. Ancient sources emphasize the Pope's role. Modern historians are more cautious. The practical factors were almost certainly decisive, but the meeting happened and Leo did make the embassy. It is one of those moments where religious authority and political reality intersect in ways that would define the following century. The Bishop of Rome was acting as a political negotiator for a city the emperor had abandoned. The Pope was filling a space the state could no longer fill. Attila returned to his territory north of the Danube. He died in 453 AD, according to the Gothic historian Jordanes, of a nosebleed on his wedding night, though modern interpreters suggest internal hemorrhage. His death was the best thing that could have happened to the remnants of Roman power. The Hunnic Empire depended on his personal authority and control of tribute extraction. When he died, it fragmented with remarkable speed. The subject peoples rose against their Hunnic overlords. Within 2 years, Hunnic power east of the Rhine had collapsed. The single greatest external pressure on the West was suddenly gone. But by then, the West had used up most of what remained. Aetius had kept the empire alive through a combination of military skill, political cunning, and the strategic management of competing barbarian forces. In 454 AD, he was rewarded for this service by being murdered in the throne room by Emperor Valentinian Roman III with his own hand. Ancient sources are terse on the motivation: jealousy, court intrigue, fear of Aetius's power, possibly the manipulation of rivals who wanted Aetius removed. A contemporary general reportedly said that Valentinian had cut off his right hand with his left. The following year, Valentinian himself was murdered by supporters of a senator whose wife he had violated. The succession crisis that followed was almost without precedent even in the chaotic 5th century. Between 455 and 476 AD, 21 years, 9 emperors held the Western throne. Most were created by Germanic military commanders who held the real power. Most were deposed or murdered. The pattern had been seen before in the 3rd century, but there was a crucial difference. In the 3rd century, the successful military emperors had eventually stabilized the state. In the 5th century, there was no longer enough state to stabilize. In 455 AD, the Vandal king Gazaric arrived at the mouth of the Tiber with a fleet. Pope Leo I negotiated with him, extracting a promise that there would be no fires, no killings, and no torture. The Vandals spent 2 weeks in Rome. They took everything portable of value: gold, silver, bronze statues, the sacred temple vessels, the gilded tiles from the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus. They took hostages, including the widow of the murdered Valentinian Roman III. The second sack of Rome in 45 years completed what 410 AD had begun. The city could no longer be considered inviolable, and the regime that claimed to protect it could no longer credibly make that claim. What followed was the slow, almost administrative end of the Western Empire. The title emperor still existed, still meant something to those who held it, still carried theoretical authority over Roman law and Roman territory. But the territory was increasingly ruled by Germanic kings: Visigoths in Gaul and Spain, Vandals in Africa, Burgundians in the Rhone Valley, Franks in the north, Anglo-Saxons in Britain, who administered in their own names while sometimes acknowledging a nominal Roman sovereignty. The emperor in Ravenna governed Italy and whatever loyalty he could still claim elsewhere. In 461 AD, the general Ricimer, of Visigoth and Suebian ancestry, the most powerful man in the West, installed and removed emperors as it suited him. He was not unusual in this. The pattern of a Germanic strongman operating behind an imperial puppet was the structural reality of the late Western Empire. The fiction of Roman authority served the military commanders because it gave legal legitimacy to their positions, land grants, and titles. The moment the fiction became more trouble than it was worth, it would be discarded. That moment came in 476 AD. The Western Roman army, which was by this point composed almost entirely of Germanic troops, demanded a third of the land of Italy as payment for its service. This was not an unprecedented demand. The Visigoths had received land in Gaul in 418 AD under similar terms. But the Emperor Orsts, who had just installed his young son Romulus as emperor, refused. Odoacer, the Germanic commander who led the mutiny, killed Orsts and deposed Romulus. Romulus Augustulus, his name carried a sardonic echo of both Romulus, the founder of Rome, and Augustus, its first emperor, was 16 years old. He was not considered a legitimate emperor even by his contemporaries. The Eastern court had recognized Julius Nepos, who had been deposed by Orsts and was living in exile in Dalmatia, as the legitimate Western ruler. Odoacer sent the young man to live in a villa in Campania with an annual pension of 6,000 gold pieces. He sent the Western imperial regalia to Constantinople with the message that one emperor was enough for the whole Roman world. Zeno, the Eastern emperor, acknowledged the gesture without giving Odoacer the formal title of Western emperor. The word acknowledged covers a diplomatic reality. Odoacer ruled Italy as a king under nominal Eastern sovereignty. He governed competently. Roman law continued. The Senate continued. Latin continued. The Roman Church continued to grow in authority. What had ended was not Roman civilization, but the Roman state's ability to tax, recruit, and command across the Western provinces as a unified entity. The question of why the East survived while the West collapsed is central to understanding what the collapse actually was. The two halves shared the same institutional structure, the same legal tradition, the same imperial ideology. They had divided only in 395 AD, yet by 476 AD, the East was still functioning as a complex bureaucratic state with a standing professional army, while the West was a collection of Germanic kingdoms acknowledging a fiction of Roman authority. The explanations are multiple and they reinforce each other. The East was wealthier. Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor were more densely populated, more urbanized, more commercially productive, and more intensively farmed than the provinces of the West. The East could collect more tax from a smaller territory. That revenue paid for a professional army rather than dependence on Foederati. That army allowed the Eastern court to negotiate from a position of real power rather than tactical desperation. Constantinople was also easier to defend. Theodosius' Roman II triple walls, built in the early 5th century, made Constantinople effectively impregnable with the military technology of the time. The city did not need to fear a siege the way Rome did. It sat at the crossroads of European and Asian trade routes, concentrated wealth, and gave the Eastern Empire a logistical and strategic core that the West, with its sprawling inland frontiers and diminished Italian revenues, could not replicate. The Eastern court also maintained a more continuous political culture. Successions were disputed and violent at times, but the Eastern Empire in the 5th century did not go through the same rapid cycling of puppet emperors under the control of military strongmen. The bureaucracy was more deeply rooted, the church more closely integrated into imperial governance, and the Eastern provincial aristocracy more reliably connected to the imperial center. These differences were not absolute. The East had its crises, but they were real enough to matter in the comparison. There is also the question of luck and direction. The Huns focused most of their devastating attention on the West, on the Danube, on Gaul, on Italy. The East paid tribute, large amounts of tribute at times, and occasionally suffered militarily, but did not experience the sustained campaigns that devastated Western provincial populations and drained Western military resources. When the Hunnic Empire collapsed after Attila's death, it was the peoples of the East's Balkan frontier that bore the first pressure of the newly liberated Gothic peoples, but by then the West was already past recovery. There is a pattern in the comparison that is worth holding. The Eastern Empire solved, or deferred, its most dangerous frontier problems by paying money. It had enough money to pay. The Western Empire increasingly did not. The structural explanation for the divergence between East and West comes down, in the end, to this. The East had wealthier provinces, needed less frontier land to defend, could maintain a professional army on the revenue available, and could afford to buy off threats that would have required expensive military campaigns. The West had a longer, more permeable frontier, wealthier provinces that were progressively lost to the Vandals and Gothic kingdoms, and therefore a decreasing ability to pay for the soldiers and ships that might have recovered them. The spiral was not inevitable at any single point, but each loss made the next loss more likely. What happened to the people of the Western Empire when the state collapsed around them? The answer differs dramatically depending on where you were and who you were. The urban aristocracies of Gaul and Italy often survived the transition to Germanic rule with their estates, their social status, and even their administrative roles intact. Germanic kings needed administrators who could read Latin, write law, and manage tax records. The skills of the Roman senatorial class remained valuable to the successor kingdoms. Men like Cassiodorus served the Ostrogothic king Theodoric in roles that would have been recognizable to a Roman senator of a century earlier. The church was the institution that most continuously bridged the Roman and post-Roman world. Bishops had been exercising civil as well as religious authority since Constantine's reign. As the imperial state withdrew from the periphery, church authority filled the space. The bishop became the most important local official in many cities, negotiating with Germanic kings, organizing charity, maintaining records, and providing the continuity of Roman law in sacralized form. The Catholic Christianity that Rome had adopted became the ideological inheritance through which the successor kingdoms understood themselves and claimed legitimacy. The successor kingdoms that replaced Roman administration were not uniformly catastrophic. In some cases, Italy under the Ostrogothic king Theodoric, who ruled from 493 to 526 AD, the transition preserved considerable Roman administrative functionality. Theodoric employed Roman senators in key administrative roles, including Cassiodorus as his chief minister. He maintained Roman law for Roman citizens. He undertook building projects. He corresponded with the Eastern court in terms designed to present his rule as a continuation of legitimate Roman governance rather than its replacement. The philosopher Boethius, who wrote the Consolation of Philosophy while awaiting execution on Theodoric's orders, was a Roman senator who had served an Ostrogothic king. a detail that says something about how thoroughly the two worlds had interpenetrated. But Theodoric was unusual in his administrative ambition and in the relative peace of Italy during his reign. Elsewhere, the picture was harsher. Gaul under the Franks was militarized and violent in ways the 5th-century Gallic aristocracy, which had produced elegant Latin poets and letter-writers like Sidonius Apollinaris, even as Rome was crumbling around them, would not have recognized as Roman. Spain oscillated between Visigothic rule and Byzantine reconquest for a century. Britain, without any surviving central administration, fragmented into small kingdoms, lost most of its urban population, and underwent the most complete material transformation of any former Roman province. For ordinary people, farmers, craftsmen, traders, soldiers, the record is less clear, and the experience was far less comfortable. Brian Ward Perkins, in his careful analysis of the archaeological and material evidence, documents a dramatic decline in living standards across much of the West in the 5th and 6th centuries. Pottery becomes cruder and less widely distributed. Building in durable materials becomes rare outside churches. Literacy declines sharply outside the church. Long-distance trade in everyday goods, which had been a remarkable feature of the Roman economy, collapses. The Mediterranean stopped being an integrated economic zone and became a collection of regional economies with limited connections. This is not the picture of a smooth transformation. It is the picture of a material civilization that contracted, became localized, and lost many of the institutions that had produced its complexity. The roads were still there, but no one was maintaining them. The aqueducts were still there, but fewer were repaired when they broke. The legal texts were still there, but fewer people could read them. The form persisted in the absence of the function. Peter Heather argues that this material collapse was the result of external military pressure, that the Germanic and Hunnic invasions overwhelmed a state that was not in terminal decline before 376 AD, and that without the Hunnic migration, the empire might have gone on indefinitely. Peter Brown and the scholars of late antiquity argue that the transition was more gradual, more culturally productive, and more genuinely transformative than collapse implies. Both views have evidence behind them. The material decline was real. The cultural continuity was also real. The challenge for historians, as for anyone trying to understand the period, is holding both truths simultaneously. The civilization that grew from the wreckage of the Western Empire was unmistakably Roman in many of its most important features. Its language was Latin or Latin-descended. Its church was organized on Roman administrative lines. Its law was Roman law, modified and adapted. Its most prestigious historical and philosophical texts were Roman. Its architecture for sacred buildings derived from Roman forms. The Germanic kingdoms that replaced Rome did not want to destroy what Rome had built. They wanted to inherit it, to be recognized as its continuation, to speak the language and use the forms that made authority legible. In that sense, Rome did not fall. It became something else. The Western Roman Empire as a unified tax-collecting, army-paying, law-enforcing state ceased to exist in 476 AD. But the Roman project, the idea that a universal civilizational order could be defined, articulated, and defended, passed into the church, into the legal traditions, into the political language of the successor kingdoms, and ultimately into the self-image of medieval and early modern Europe. Charlemagne would call himself Roman Emperor in 800 AD, 3 centuries after Romulus Augustulus had been sent to his villa on the bay. This is why the fall of the Western Empire matters more as a question than as a date. 476 AD is a useful endpoint because something real did end then. A particular form of integrated political authority over a particular territory. But the causes of that ending reach back to the crisis of the 3rd century, to the structural decisions of Diocletian and Constantine, to the Hunnic migration of the 370, to the strategic mistakes of 408 AD, to the loss of Africa, to the inability of the Western court to stabilize succession across the 5th century. It is not a story with a single villain or a single decisive moment. It is a story about the limits of what even an enormous and sophisticated state can sustain when multiple pressures converge and reinforce each other over decades. And it is a story with a strange, quiet ending. The last emperor of the West was a teenager named after Rome's founder and its first emperor. He was deposed by a Germanic commander who did not want the title, who governed Italy competently for the next 17 years, and who was eventually displaced in turn by an Ostrogothic king acting in the name of the Eastern Court. The city of Rome continued to exist. The Senate continued to meet. The Pope continued to grow in authority. The libraries that preserved Roman literature continued to be copied, imperfectly, with growing losses, into the following centuries. The empire had gone. What it left behind was both less than what it had been and more durable than anyone at the time would have predicted. The Roman idea did not perish in 476 AD. It transformed, contracted, survived in fragments, and eventually shaped the world that emerged from the long struggle to fill the space that Rome had left. Whether that is better described as a fall or a becoming depends on where you stand, and what you think the most important parts of the story are. What is certain is that the world before the Hunnic migrations and the world after Odoacer's letter were genuinely different places. The transformation was real, the losses were real, and the question of how such a large and apparently permanent structure came apart in a single century is one that people have been asking ever since, and have not, yet, completely answered.